I spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon about 6 years ago helping a friend disassemble an old timber frame barn in central Pennsylvania. The structure was built sometime around 1740, best we could figure from the markings. And here is what stopped me cold. When we finally separated the first major beam joint, a mortise and tenon held together with nothing but a single oak peg, the tenon's shoulder was still tight. I mean tight. After nearly 300 years of freeze and thaw, humidity swings, and Lord knows what else, that joint had not budged. No glue, no metal, just wood meeting wood, and one little peg driven through an offset hole. That is when someone explained to me what draw boring was, and honestly, it changed the way I think about joinery. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how this joint works, why the offset is the secret to everything, and how you can start using it in your own shop. Plus, stick around because at the end I will show you a dry fitting trick with a draw bore pin that will save you from ever committing to a bad joint again. Let me show you what I found. The drawboard mortise and tenon is one of the oldest engineered joints in woodworking, and what makes it remarkable is how simple it is once you understand the thinking behind it. This is not a decorative technique. This is a structural solution that medieval craftsmen developed because they needed joints that would hold forever without anything the modern world takes for granted. And the beautiful part is that every single one of us can do this with basic tools in a home shop. To really appreciate why draw boring works the way it does, you need to understand the people who perfected it. This technique has its deepest roots in medieval European timber framing, particularly in England, France, and the Germanic regions, going back to at least the 12th and 13th centuries. These were the craftsmen building guild halls, churches, barns, and manor, houses, structures that were expected to stand for generations. They did not have modern adhesives. They did not have lag bolts or structural screws. What they had was an extraordinary understanding of how wood behaves under stress. The tradition came to America with the earliest settlers, and you can find drawboard joints in New England meeting houses, Pennsylvania barns, and Virginia tobacco barns dating back to the 1600s and 1700s. The barn I was helping disassemble that afternoon was part of that direct lineage. What drove the development of this joint was a practical problem. When you cut a mortise and tenon and fit it together dry, the joint might feel snug at first, but wood moves. Seasonal moisture changes cause the tenon to shrink slightly across its width, and over time, the shoulder can open up. Without a reliable clamp, without glue that could withstand centuries of weather, these craftsmen needed a way to mechanically pull the joint tight and keep it tight permanently. That is exactly what the offset peg hole does. It turns a simple wooden peg into a perpetual clamp. And the thinking behind it is so elegant that modern engineers still study it. The philosophy is straightforward. Do not fight the wood. Design a joint where the natural properties of wood, its compression strength, its resilience, its ability to hold shape under load, do the work for you. So let us start with what draw boring actually is, because the name alone confuses a lot of people. A drawboard joint is a standard mortise and tenon with one critical difference. When you drill the hole for the peg through the cheeks of the mortise, and then separately mark and drill the hole through the tenon, you intentionally offset the tenon hole toward the shoulder by a small amount. We are talking about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, depending on the size of the joint. That is it. That is the whole secret. When you drive the peg through, it enters the hole, in the near cheek of the mortise cleanly, but then it hits the offset hole in the tenon. Because the holes do not line up perfectly, the peg has to bend slightly as it passes through, and in doing so, it physically pulls the tenon deeper into the mortise. The shoulder draws up tight against the face of the mortised piece, and it stays there. The peg is now under constant shear stress, the tenon is under constant tension toward the shoulder, and the whole assembly is locked. What amazed me when I first understood this is that the offset is doing the job of a clamp permanently. You are not relying on glue to hold the shoulder tight. You are not relying on friction alone. The geometry of the offset creates a mechanical force that never lets go. I tested this on a white oak frame joint about 4 years ago, a 2-inch by 3-inch tenon in a 4x6 beam. The offset was just 3/32 of an inch. I drove a 3/8 inch white oak peg through with a wooden mallet, and when I tried to pull that joint apart afterward, it was not going anywhere. I would have had to destroy the wood to separate it. Now the peg itself matters more than most people realize, And this is where I see a lot of folks get into trouble. The old-timers did not just grab any scrap and whittle a dowel. The peg stock was selected and prepared with real care. The best drawbore pegs are riven, not sawn. That means they are split along the grain rather than cut across it. When you rive a piece of straight-grained white oak or hickory, every fiber runs continuously from one end to the other. That gives you tremendous shear strength. A sawn dowel, even from the same species, will have grain run out where the saw crossed fibers, and that is where it will snap when you drive it through an offset hole. The species I have had the best results with are white oak, hickory, and black locust. All three are dense, strong, and naturally resistant to moisture. For furniture scale joints, I use pegs that are 3/8 of an inch in diameter. For timber framing, I go up to 1 inch or even 1 1/4 inches. The peg should be slightly tapered on the leading end, brought to a gentle point with a block plane or a knife, so it can find its way into the offset hole without splitting the tenon. And it should be dry. Bone dry. Some of the old timber framers actually kiln dried their pegs or kept them near the hearth before driving them. The reason is that a dry peg driven into slightly moister framing timber will absorb ambient moisture over time and swell, locking itself even tighter. That is not an accident. That is engineering. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now here's where precision really counts. Drilling the holes. You start by boring the peg hole through both cheeks of the mortise first, with the tenon removed. I use a brace and bit for this because it gives me control and I can feel the wood as I go, but a drill press works fine for furniture scale joints. For a 3/8 inch peg, I bore a 3/8 inch hole straight through both cheek walls of the mortise, keeping everything square. Next, you insert the tenon fully into the mortise with the shoulder seated tight, exactly where you want it in the finished joint. Now take a drill bit or a brad point, bit one size smaller than your peg hole and use it as a transfer punch. Push it through the hole in the mortise cheek so it marks the tenon face. Pull the tenon out, and you will see the witness mark on the tenon. Here is the critical step. You do not drill the tenon hole on that mark. You move toward the shoulder. For furniture work, I offset 1/16 of an inch. For timber framing with larger pegs, I go a full eighth. Mark your new center point, and bore through the tenon at that offset location. That is your draw bore offset. When everything goes back together and the peg is driven through, that little shift is what pulls the whole joint home. One mistake I see people make is offsetting too much. If you go beyond 1/8 of an inch on a 3/8 peg, you are asking the peg to bend too sharply, and it may snap inside the joint. The old rule of thumb I was taught is that the offset should never exceed 1/3 of the peg diameter. That has never failed me. Driving the peg is one of the most satisfying moments in woodworking, but you have to do it right. Assemble the joint dry first with the shoulder seated. I always use a drawbore pin, which is just a tapered steel rod, to test the alignment before I commit. Slide the pin through and feel how it pulls the joint. If the shoulder closes up nicely and the pin passes without excessive resistance, you are good. If it binds hard or the tenon cracks, your offset may be too aggressive or your holes may not be aligned on the correct axis. Better to find that out with a pin than with a peg you cannot remove. Once you are satisfied, take your prepared peg with its tapered leading end, apply a small amount of tallow or wax to the tip if you like, and drive it through with firm, confident mallet blows. You will feel the resistance change as the peg enters the offset. The joint will visibly close. The shoulder will seat with a satisfying thunk. Drive it until the peg protrudes slightly from the far cheek, then let it sit. I trim the excess flush after 24 hours once everything has settled. What I want you to notice when you drive that peg is the sound. A good drawboard joint changes tone as the peg seats. It goes from a hollow tap to a solid, dead thud. That is the sound of the shoulder fully seated and the wood under compression. The old carpenters listened for that. It told them the joint was home. This next part is what really fascinated me because it explains why these joints actually get tighter over time instead of loosening. When the tapered peg is driven through the offset holes, the wood fibers in both the peg and the surrounding hole walls are placed under compression. Wood under compression does not just stay put, it slowly conforms. The compressed fibers in the peg and the hole walls gradually interlock at a cellular level as moisture cycles cause the wood to swell and shrink microscopically. Each cycle pushes the fibers a little tighter together. This is the same principle that makes a well-fitted timber frame more solid after 50 years than it was the day it was raised. The joint is not static, it is alive in a very slow structural sense. The offset guarantees that there is always tension pulling the tenon toward the shoulder, and the peg is always under shear load. Nothing is relaxed. Nothing is passive. Every component is doing a job all the time. Contrast that with a modern glued joint, where the adhesive can creep under sustained load, or a metal fastener, where repeated wood movement can wallow out the hole over decades. The drawboard peg actually benefits from the very forces that weaken other connections. That is why that barn joint I saw in Pennsylvania was still tight after nearly 300 years. Now, let me talk about sizing, because a drawboard joint for a jewelry box is very different from one for a barn bent. For furniture scale work, I typically use tenons that are 3/8 to 1/2 inch thick, with a 3/8 inch peg. The offset is 1/16 of an inch. This is perfect for table aprons, chair stretchers, bed rails, and door frames. For exterior doors and heavy furniture, I step up to a 1/2 inch peg with a 3/32 offset. For timber framing, you are working with tenons that are 2 inches thick or more, pegs of 1 inch diameter, and offsets of a full 1/8 of an inch. The proportions stay consistent. What changes is the scale. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself before I understood what drawboring was really about. The first pattern is reaching for glue as the default. Most of us squeeze glue into every mortise because that is what we were taught. But glue is doing one job, resisting tension, and it does that job well only as long as the glue line stays intact. A drawbore peg handles tension mechanically and gets stronger with age. I am not saying never use glue, but I am saying the joint should not depend on it. The second pattern is using store-bought dowels as pegs. I did this for years. Those dowels are sawn from random stock, the grain runs every which way, and they will snap inside an offset hole before they do their job. Once I started riving my own pegs from straight-grained white oak, the difference was night and day. The third pattern is drilling the peg hole after assembly and calling it pinned. A pinned mortise and tenon with aligned holes is a fine joint, but it is not drawboard. It relies on the peg to resist shear only. There is no clamping action, no tension pulling the shoulder tight. The offset is what makes this joint fundamentally different, and skipping it means you are leaving the best part on the table. The fourth pattern is over-engineering with metal hardware. I have seen people add angle brackets and steel plates to mortise and tenon frames that would have held beautifully with a single drawboard peg. Trust the wood. Trust the geometry. That is the lesson these old craftsmen keep teaching me. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. Get yourself a drawbore pin. You can buy one from a timber framing supplier, or you can make one in about 10 minutes from a piece of 3/8 inch steel rod. Grind or file a gentle taper on one end. Smooth it so it will not tear wood fibers, and keep it with your marking tools. Before you ever commit to driving a real peg, slide that pin through your assembled joint. It will show you exactly how the offset is behaving. If the shoulder closes up smoothly and the pin passes with firm but manageable resistance, your layout is perfect. If it binds violently or the tenon starts to split, you know to adjust before you have a peg stuck permanently in a bad joint. I use mine on every single drawboard joint I make, and it has saved me more than once. The old timber framers carried these in their tool rolls the way we carry tape measures. Once you use one, you will never skip the step again. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place, with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time. Take care, folks. I will see you in the shop.